Ladies and gentlemen, would you take your seats, please? Okay, if chairs are turned round and you're all ready. Well, we've got a wonderful turnout today, and I think we all know the reason why. 2 words, Lady Glenconnor. So without further ado, would you welcome her to the stage, Nicholas? All right. Okay. And while Nicholas is still standing, I think we want to give a big round of applause to Nicholas and Vanessa Courtney, who have facilitated Lady Glenconnor's business. Are you happy sitting?
I might say, no, you carry. Well, I'm thrilled to be here because I've been a member of Hurlingham since the 70s. I'm now so old they allow me in for nothing. So it's wonderful to see so many people here. I hope you can hear. I'm a bit worried about this person.
But I think they can all hear you. So the first question is, why did you decide to write your memoirs? Why did you decide to write your memoirs?
It was to do with the Crown, actually. And Helena Bonham Carter rang me up and said, I can't do this. And talking about Princess Margaret, I've got 2 other ladies in waiting here. So normally my audiences, I don't know who they are, but I know that there they are. There's Liz and Jay sitting there. But funnily enough, I felt that Princess Margaret was sort of in the room with me. And I really sort of, that was one of the reasons I thought of writing a book. And the other one was that I hated somebody called Craig Brown. I hope he's not sitting here.
No.
But he wrote this horrible book about Princess Margaret. And it just made me so angry that, she'd been such a wonderful friend. And I wanted to give another sort of, really to say how she was, what a wonderful friend she was to me. And anyway, so out came my book. And Hodder took a punt on me because it could have been the most terrible flop. I've never written a book at all. I've never written anything really. And suddenly it sort of took off. I mean, I did, when I was doing the synopsis, I thought, well, I have got a story.
You
I have had a life, you know. And
shall we start at the beginning? What was it?
Sorry, I can't hear.
What was it like growing up at Holcombe?
What was it like growing up at Holcombe? Right. Well, I don't know. Some of you may have been to Holcombe. I don't know. It was. I didn't. When I was small, my father was in the Scots Guards, and so we only went there for holidays. But it was, of course, only 10 miles away from Sandringham. So my father was an equerry to the Duke of York before he became king. And so my sister and I, Carrie and I, we used to see the Queen, and Princess Elizabeth as she was then, and Princess Margaret, and they used to come over. And Princess Margaret was my friend because she was nearer in age to me, and quite naughty actually. We used to have a great time. And there's a wonderful photograph of us all standing in a row. And I said to Princess Margaret, "Why are you looking at my feet? You seem to be gazing at my feet." And she said, "Well, yes, because you had silver shoes. I had brown lace-ups. I was so jealous." The Queen was sort of much, she was older and a bit disapproving because Princess Margaret and I were always sort of ragging around. And she said, "You mustn't do that, Anne. And Margaret, you mustn't do this." And then, of course, the war came, and that changed everything. Because especially in Norfolk, because Hitler was meant to land, you know, there. He had all his flat-bottomed boats in Belgium and Holland, and so all the children, not only us, we all moved away, and my sister and I went up to Scotland, and my father was in the Scots Guards in Egypt, and my mother went out to be with him. So we were, my darling Bridget Airley looked after us. And we had war work. I mean, a lot of you here, I'm sure, remember the war. And one of our things we did was pick sphagnum moss, which was used in bandages. They used to put it on wounds. And then we used to knit gloves for the minesweepers. And then there was a Courtigy, which was a big house, was a convalescent home for Polish officers. And we used to play snakes and ladders. We used to sit on their beds and play snakes and ladders. That was our war work, anyway. But
and then you decided you and your sister were going to try and kill Hitler.
Oh yes, well, Carrie and I had this thing, because we knew that we thought, I mean, Hitler might have invaded, and they had all chosen, Hitler we thought was going to Windsor, but actually he'd chosen Blenheim, and I think Goering or Himmler was going to live in Holcombe. So Carrie and I realized that we might have an opportunity to meet Hitler, and we knew that he liked the sort of Aryan look. So we had a sort of, we kept one or two jam jars under our beds where we put really disgusting things, and we were going to go back to Holcombe, hopefully meet Hitler, and say, darling, we used to practice with our teddy bears, darling Mr. Hitler, we've got a wonderful drink we've been keeping for you. And we were absolutely sure we were going to kill Hitler, but we hadn't gone any further than that. We didn't quite realise what might happen to us. But anyway, that's what we felt.
And then one of the consequences of the war was that your mother started a pottery. And what was your role in that?
Yes, in the war, we had 2 prisoner of war camps in the park at Holcombe. And we had Italians, first of all, who were absolutely charming. They used to wave and absolutely delightful. And in fact, at the end of the war, when nobody wanted to go and work in big houses, my mother had, I think, about 12 Italian girls who were sort of sisters of some of the prisoners of war. And then we had the Germans, and they were very, very different. We were terrified. Carrie and I had ponies. We used to sort of gallop round the camp. But one of them was a potter, and he started to, we had our own, we always made all our own bricks, and everything was made for the estate. And he'd made his own little kiln. And it gave my mother the idea. And she and my sister Carrie were very, very artistic, but I wasn't. I was spent very boring, something called fettling and sponging, which was sort of very, very boring. I got rather fed up with this. So my mother said, well, what would you like to do, Anne? And I said, well, I'd like to sell. And so she said, right. And so I remember she lent me her mini miner, and I went all round the coast to this sort of fancy goods shops and that sort of thing, staying in travelling salesmen's hotels. And I was the only woman on the road, and the only aristocrat, actually. And they were amazed. So I used to sit in the lounge with some one light hanging, reading, rather embarrassing, reading my book. And then they come in and talk to me, and were amazed, you know, when they realised where I come from. And then at 9 o'clock, a sort of trolley used to be wheeled in, coffee and tea. And they just looked at me and said, will you be mother? And so I was mother. And then from there, I went to America and sold, or tried to sell, pottery. But it was very, very different, because everybody sort of knew one in England. And I went off to Saks. I remember staying, luckily, with Mrs. Rahn, who's Ginny Early's mother. And she did look a bit surprised when I said, well, I'm just going off, you know. And of course I got there, and they said, well, have you got, who are you? Have you got an appointment? And I said, well, no. Well, they said, come back in 6 months' time. So I went back to Mrs. Rahn and sort of said, you know, what shall I do? And anyway, she's marvellous. One telephone call, and I had an appointment. And so I went all around America selling pottery. And then I was back with her in New York when the maid came in the morning with a telegram. I said, I think this is from your mother. And I thought, oh God, something awful has happened. And the telegram said, and you must come back. You've been, the Queen has asked you to be a Maid of Honour at the Coronation. So,
well, and then you decided, obviously, you were going to be taking part in that. And what about all the preparations and the near miss that you had, and also the fact that you were one of the early tabloid headlines?
Well, yes. I mean, I got back, and I must say it was terribly exciting. We had lots of rehearsals. The Duke of Norfolk, who organised the whole coronation, had done it for the Queen's father, the late King, just before the war. So he knew actually what to do, and he was extraordinary. I mean, every detail. People say, but why were you chosen? Well, I was extremely lucky because we had to be daughters of earls, marquises or dukes. We had to be sort of nice figures, I suppose, the right height. And obviously I'm married, and I fitted the bill with 5 others. And we started the rehearsals. And we only did one rehearsal with the Queen, which was at Buckingham Palace, when she wore a sort of curtain or something. We sort of trailed up and down behind her. And we always practiced with the Duchess of Norfolk. Anyway, the great day came, and I mean, I never had, because of the war, we'd had rationing, no clothes, I mean, and people often say to me, well, you led such a privileged life. And I said, actually, I didn't really, because we all had the same life during the war. I was always hungry at boarding school. We were always cold. We had no clothes, It was a very good leveller, actually, the war. But anyway, suddenly I went off to Norman Hartnell. I was fitted for this wonderful dress. I mean, because my coming out dress had been a parachute. My mother was absolutely thrilled. She was always, because one of the American aerodromes near Holcombe, one of the officers had given her a parachute. And my father didn't help, because he said, oh, Anne, I do hope you don't look like a parachute when you come out. And my father wasn't very, at my wedding, I remember my father saying, well, I did look actually quite nice. He said, I suppose you'll do. But anyway, there we had these wonderful dresses. They were embroidered down the back, because we were seen from the back, really. And the night of the coronation, the whole of London, and we couldn't get a room anywhere. And my mother had just been asked to be a lady in waiting. So she was going to walk just behind me, which was great. And anyway, we had Uncle Jack, who was Queen Mary's lord in waiting, very kindly gave us his flat. And my mother, it was just one bedroom. My mother had the bed and I had the floor. So the night of the coronation, I was on a mattress on the floor. I didn't sleep very much. And I remember in the morning, the sort of dawn came, it was pouring with rain, and lit up my dress. I remember thinking, God, amazing, I'm going to wear this fantastic dress and be part of history, really. And anyway, I put on my dress. My mother went to Buckingham Palace, where she was going in one of the carriages, and I went in the car to Westminster Abbey. And as we went along, I saw these people absolutely soaking wet, but they were all saying, Hillary, Hillary. And I couldn't think why they were saying that. Of course, when I got there, somebody said, oh, well, Hillary has got to the top of Mount Everest. I think he must have waited there on purpose. How he managed to just get to the top on the morning of the coronation, I don't know. But anyway, so that was a great excitement. And we then waited, and suddenly we could hear her coming. There's a roar of people. And then round the corner came this golden coach. It was like a sort of dream of Walt Disney film. And the coach then came to a halt in front of us. 2 of the pages opened the door, and we hadn't seen her in her dress. And she looked just so wonderful. I mean, the dress was perfection. It was completely embroidered with the Commonwealth flowers and the British flowers, and she had the tiniest waist and wonderful complexion and eyes, and she just looked like a dream. The Duke of Edinburgh, who was rather fussy, he wanted to make the day wonderful, but suddenly he didn't have exactly a role, I think. So we knew exactly what to do, but anyway, he came and sort of tried to tell us what to do. And then in we went, and then people say, "Did the Queen say anything to you?" And she didn't actually at that moment. And we were all waiting with her back to us. We were all standing there with the tray, and had little satin handles under it. And we were just waiting there. And she suddenly just turned around, "Ready, girls?" And off we went. And because we hadn't practiced with her all that much, only with the Duchess of Norfolk who'd taken she walked slightly faster, so we just had to adjust. And then off we went. And I mean, it was like a sort of medieval tapestry. I mean, they built right up to the top of Westminster Abbey, and all the Commonwealth people were in their national dress, and all the peers and peeresses. I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary. And anyway, there was a moment, I suppose one of the most moving moments, was when the Queen was she was anointed, and they took all her regalia away from her and dressed her in a very, very simple white dress, which Lord Cholmondeley, who'd never dressed anybody, let alone himself, couldn't do the hooks and eyes. And so the Duke of Norfolk got more and more angry and said, "Look, if you can't do the hooks and eyes, we'll have to put poppers." So they put poppers. And I said afterwards to the Queen, "Was it okay?" And she said, "No, it was not." She said, "Lord Cholmondeley did this the whole way down my back." And I was doing sort of this sort of thing. Anyway, so there she was, and the cameras were turned off because she didn't want, it was a holy moment that she didn't want the cameras on. So they were turned off, and they put a canopy over the Queen, and so very, very few people saw the actual anointing, except for us. We were saying, luckily I had my back to the wall, the back, and suddenly I started to feel faint. I thought, "My God," and I wiggled my toes, and we had files of smelling salts in our gloves, which I broke, but it didn't seem to do any good. And I thought, I just cannot faint in front of millions and billions of people. Luckily, I had a wonderful gentleman called Black Rod, who was dressed entirely in black velvet and had a sort of billiard cue he was holding. I think he saw me going backwards and forwards, because he put his arm and pinioned me to the pillar until I sort of recovered and felt okay. Thank goodness. He saved the day. He was an eminent general. I think he'd won many a battle, but I think and he won one with me too. Saved the day. And then the rest of the coronation, and then one of the most marvellous moments was going on the balcony, because everywhere the Queen went, we had to go. And I remember, I mean, you couldn't put a pin between everybody. And there was just the noise, the actual sort of cheers were extraordinary, were physical. And of course, it was the end of the war, we'd won the war, everybody hoped it was the beginning of a new Elizabethan age. And every time the Queen turned to go in, they shouted and everything. And it was an extraordinary, in those days we had an air force too. And so, there we stood with all the aeroplanes going over us. And then we had the photographs taken. And the Duke of Edinburgh wanted Baron to take the photographs. And Queen Elizabeth said, no, Cecil Beaton must take the photographs. So there we were, and the Duke of Edinburgh, for some reason, kept on telling us where to stand, and he was being rather fussy. And suddenly, Cecil I could see he was getting rather annoyed. He suddenly put down his camera, turned to the Duke of Edinburgh and said, "Sir, if you'd like to take the photographs, do." Everyone was horrified. Anyway, I think the Duke of Edinburgh realised he'd gone too far and sort of moved off. And then I went back that evening with some friends because I knew the Queen was coming out on the balcony, and there she did. She came out after dinner, and I thought, earlier on in the day I was up there on the balcony, and now I'm standing chairing her. And then I had a very odd end, actually, to the coronation, because my uncle, Tom Harvey, all the members of the household looked after somebody. My father looked after the Queen of Greece and various people. And my uncle, for some reason, had 2 sheikhs, and he took them to the 400. Well, I don't know what he thought, because they don't drink, at least they don't drink in public, and they don't dance. So they sat there with me and my uncle, and I think somebody else, trying to make conversation to them. Anyway, I don't think it was a great success. They gave us a gold watch each, and off we went. And that was the end of my...
Now, in 1956, you married Colin Tennant, and Graham Norton described him as colourful, but how would you describe him?
Oh, I think it's colourful. The one or two people who know, I can see poor Nick Courtney over there, blanching, thought of mentioning Colin. Well, Colin, the thing was that my father wanted me to marry one of his friends. He's the same age as my father, Lord Stair. And I said, well, Dad, I don't think there's anything sort of between John Stair and me. So my father's frightfully disappointed. He said, well, okay, what about his brother then, Colin Dalrymple? So I said, okay. So I went out with him and nothing happened, That's the sort of person I thought that I would probably marry. And then along came Colin, who completely sort of changed my life. He gave me the opportunity for a completely different type of life that I might have had. And of course, he then bought Mustique, which did very much change my life.
Yes, and then Princess Margaret, I know, because first of all, you had a rather interesting honeymoon, didn't you?
What do you mean on the aeroplane?
Well, no, after that, because you said...
I can't hear.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right, because you haven't talked about your honeymoon yet.
Well, my honeymoon, I'm speaking again this evening, and I thought perhaps it was a more suitable story for this evening, but... Well, I hope you had a drink or two. Well, yes, because, I had the most fantastic wedding at Holcombe. Because I've got no brothers, my father treated me as a boy, really. And I, learnt all sorts of things. And I worked on the estate and all that sort of thing. And my actual wedding, I had 3 wedding cakes. There was a tent for the workers, there was a tent for the tenant farmers, and there was a tent for the friends. And we had Tony Snowden, who was just a photographer in those days. My father rather rudely called him Tony Snapshot, which I think he didn't really like. Anyway, he took wonderful photographs because he was the most wonderful photographer. And anyway, so we had this very, very grand wedding, and we were going to Paris for our honeymoon. Well, we didn't arrive there till very, very late, the Lottie Hotel. And when we went up to the bridal suite, it had 2 single beds in it. Well, Colin had promised me that when we're married, I'll never lose my temper again. And of course, I sort of believed him. But anyway, there was a most terrible sort of tantrum. And he stormed down to the desk at about 3 o'clock in the morning when there's a tiny night porter. And the night porter said, well, the only thing I can suggest is a double mattress in the basement. Will you help me carry it up? So I was standing there, my best dress, clutching my best handbag, and I heard this terrible noise. Everybody came out of their rooms wondering what was happening. And eventually they arrived up, put this rather filthy mattress on the bed with the night porter half under it. He got out. Colin then lay on the bed and went to sleep. And I thought, well, it is what my night of passion I was hoping for. It just didn't exist. Anyway, so nothing much happened. Colin then said, well, I've got a treat for you. We're going to do something really interesting tomorrow night. And I thought, well, maybe, dinner at the Ritz. So I put on my best dress and everything. We got into this taxi. And I did think it's all odd, because I knew where the Ritz was. We whirled past the Ritz. We went on until we got to a really sort of seedy part of Paris, where we got out of this awful hotel and went up to this room where there were two immensely unattractive people making love. And there were two sort of wing-back chairs, velvet wing-back chairs, and I just sat in one and closed my eyes and hoped, they kept on saying, would you like to join in? And I said, and I said, well, no, thank you. It's very kind of you. But I read, and afterwards, anyway, the honeymoon, you probably read the book, but it went on and on. It wasn't much fun, really.
And carrying on in that vein, I know Princess Margaret, who's a close friend, helped you to support when you boarded that British Airways flight.
Yes, Princess Margaret, it often happened I know with Queen Elizabeth too, when people have quite difficult husbands, and they often made them ladies in waiting, because the husbands couldn't object if you said, well, I'm actually going off to Australia for 3 months or something, with Princess Margaret or the Queen. One's husband had to pretend anyway to be pleased, with great honour that you're going. And Princess Margaret, after I'd had the twins, I had 3 boys and the twins, and she said, Anne, do hope you're not going to have any more children. And I said, well, no, ma'am, absolutely not. The twins were meant to just be one lovely little girl, but anyway, it turned out to be 2. And and we were on this, and Colin was thrilled when I was first asked to be lady in waiting. He said, oh, but then I can come too. And I said, no, Colin, that's not really the point. I don't think you're sort of allowed to come. But on 1 or 2 occasions he did. Davina will know that, when we were in Tuvalu, because he had the only air-conditioned office on the tiny island. It was a sort of sandbar. And he, at that point, Colin had a stamp thing. And he always said the smaller the island, the bigger the stamp, Anyway, Tuvalu was tiny, but Princess Margaret thought it was rather a good idea, perhaps he should come, because of the air-conditioned office. But on this occasion, I was also waiting. Davina wasn't with us. I was in waiting at that time, and we were flying from Los Angeles back to England, and I was sitting with, obviously, first class, and Colin, for some reason, was not put near us. And suddenly I had the most ghastly sort of tantrum going on. So I got up, I said, ma'am, I think I'd better go and find out. And Princess Margaret, no, sit down, Anne. And the thing was, I was in waiting to her, and you can't leave a member of the royal family if you're in waiting. So the next thing, I looked out of the window, and there was Colin being dragged off by 2 enormous American policemen, shouting, Anne, help. And Princess Margaret said, take no notice, Anne, just go on sitting there. And Colin arrived back 3 days later, but he did get a letter from Lord King saying, you can never fly BA again.
Princess Margaret stayed with you at Glen, an actual home in Norfolk. And in the book, there are lots of stories about sort of domestic life, including Princess Margaret's liberal use of marigolds.
Yes, when I partly wrote the book, because, as I said, because I wanted to show what a wonderful friend Princess Margaret had been to me, and another side of her that perhaps people didn't see. But she used to come and stay with me in Norfolk. I've got a very small house, no room for a maid. But she always bought her own marigold gloves and always said, I'm doing the fires, Anne, because I was a girl guide, you weren't. So, and then she said, what about your car? And I said, yes, ma'am, it does need a clean. And off she'd go and clean it. And she was fun, and we had such a lovely time. And I think the moment I realised what a wonderful friend she was when my second son, got AIDS in the 80s. And people were terrified. We didn't know how it was caught. One felt, it was the most awful. He didn't last, poor Henry, very long. But Princess Margaret always came and stayed. Quite often, I mean, I don't blame them, but some of my friends suddenly couldn't, you know. I didn't blame them if they had children. But Princess Margaret always did. She brought David and Sarah, and she always hugged Henry. And there was a place called the Lighthouse, which was built for young men who had AIDS, because they were, on the whole, their families disowned them, their partners had died, and they had nobody. And long before the Princess of Wales used to go, Princess Margaret came with me. She wasn't sort of touchy-feely, she didn't sort of hold their hands, but she sat there and amused them, told them stories, made them laugh, made them forget. And she came to Henry's memorial, and she was just a wonderful, wonderful friend. And that's, I hope, in my book, I have, you know, put that side of her, that people will realise what, you know, she had a lot of very, very good qualities, Princess Margaret. And for some reason, people only want to remember the ones that weren't so. You know, she had our grand moments, you know.
And there was one weekend at your home in Glen that you played Cupid rather inadvertently.
Well, yes, very inadvertently it was. Because we used to, Colin loved giving parties. He spent the whole night, we were always in fancy dress doing something. And especially at Glen, where the wretched village had to come and look at it. I don't know what they thought they felt. But anyway, and Princess Margaret was wonderful. She used to dress up as Brunhilde and Mae West, she did once. But anyway, this weekend, somebody young dropped out. We used to have parties for every sort of age, and it was August, and in those days everybody had left London in August, but I rang up an aunt of Colin's and said, do you know of a young man, you know, that might like to come? And she said, well, yes, I do, charming young man called Roddy Llewellyn. So I said, well, I don't know him. Oh, no, that doesn't matter. Just ring him up. And, you know. So I did. I said, would you like to come? Not for Princess Margaret. Anyway, my husband and Princess Margaret and I think Charlie, I was left sort of doing the beds at home, getting everything ready. And they went off to meet Roddy off the train. And, you know, it was so instant. When the car came back, because the security always ring you before the car arrives so that you're on the doorstep when you've got a member of the royal family staying. And I thought, very odd, where's Princess Margaret? Charlie seems to be sitting with Colin in the front seat. And there's Princess Margaret and Roddy in the back seat having a lovely time. You know, I mean, Colin, I said to Colin, what have we done? I mean, we didn't mean to do that. But I think he gave her a very happy time.
Now, in 1958, Colin decided to buy Mustique. What did you make of it?
Well, Colin, because I was having Christopher, so I couldn't go, I mean, Charlie. The first time I went to Mustique, I thought he's mad. I mean, we couldn't hardly get ashore. There were poisonous manchoneel trees. The mosquito, it wasn't called Mustique for nothing. The mosquitoes were huge. And I never sort of left Norfolk, so they loved my sort of lily white skin. And I sat on a chair, and they bit, a cane chair, and they bit me all through the holes. I remember feeling, God. And Colin said, well, mark my words, Anne, I'm going to make it a household name. And he did. And last year it was the 500th anniversary of 50th anniversary of the Mustique Company, and 65 years since Colin had bought the island. And I was flying out there, and there were the Cambridges with Prince George and Princess Charlotte on board. And I thought, you know, Colin would be so pleased, because all, I mean, the Queen came, they've all been to Mustique. And somebody said it's very unique. I mean, Colin's vision on Mustique, because I mean, we have no nightclub, no golf course, nothing like that. And yet, it's where everybody wants to come. And because Colin ran it more as if he was running an estate in England. Well, Nick will, and of course, Nick, I'm going to tell your story, Nick, can I? because after the Queen came, we were all absolutely thrilled because she never swam, the Queen, anywhere. But anyway, she did because she knew there were no photographers. And she swam in Macaroni Bay. And Nick, taking some people, I think, was it next week or fortnight, looked at her and said, you know, we have the Queen here. She swam there. We haven't changed the water since.
You first gave Princess Margaret the land, and then you built Les Jolies Eaux. But she also had quite a unique way of deciding how much land she might have for herself.
Oh, yes. Well, that was when she first came, because she said, can I come? And I said, well, ma'am, there's no water, that we've got no electric light. We had Tilly lamps. And really, I don't think, you know, you enjoy it. No, I'd love to come, Anne, absolutely. And she did. We dressed her in Colin's pyjamas, and we tied string around her ankles and feet. And anyway, we took her up to where Colin felt her house should be, because it was quite it was secure. It was on a sort of a promontory. Anyway, he put the stakes out, and suddenly he saw her. She took the stakes out. She's walking off into the jungle. Colin said, what are you doing, ma'am? Well, I think I ought to need a bit more land. So Colin said, well, why do you need a bit more land? Oh, well, I've got to have gate posts. I've got to have somewhere for my security, which is true, actually, gatehouses. So she was allowed a bit more.
And then by 1970, when you had your children, but then Princess Margaret decided she wanted you as a lady-in-waiting, there were some quite interesting roles that you had to play, and then a visit to Washington as well that you made.
Yeah, well, we went, because after Mustique, she always said, I can't possibly go straight back to England, and jet lag. So we always had to go to New York, where Drew Heinz very kindly had us to stay, and then flew us all back on Concorde. So, we did visit, we also went to Washington, I think the Royal Ballet, and we saw, the Bushes were wonderful, actually. I like Mrs. Bush very much. But Mrs. Reagan was rather, the first time we went to the White House, there was a sort of lift going up to the Oval Office and where they lived. And I was just about to sort of put my foot in. But she said, no, not you, Lady Glenconnor. Miss Brown is going to take you down to see the presents, which was sort of in the cellar, or the presents that the ambassadors, the presidents were given. Eventually, Princess Margaret actually said something, and I was taken up. But the second time we went, I think that Reagan wasn't too well, and he thought Princess Margaret was getting out. She should have got out one side of the car. It just happened for some reason I got out, and I look nowhere like Princess Margaret. Anyway, he got me by the arm and said, come on, little lady. And I said, no, Princess Margaret's just there. Princess Margaret's looking absolutely livid at me, longing. And I said, no, she's there. And actually we heard afterwards that, of course, he hadn't been very well.
Now, apart from obviously all the highs, and you've talked about Henry, but what about Charlie and what happened with him?
Yes, well, Charlie, yes, sadly, was on drugs at a very early age. Before we really knew about drugs, we didn't realise. And, you know, it was very, very difficult. In the end, the doctor said, you've got to absolutely close the door, not allow him in, you know, not support him. And, I mean, Colin, he'd been to every rehab, and we'd really done our best. But anyway, there came this awful day when we said, you must get out. And he sat, I remember, on the pavement, just outside our house, and I you know, longed to bring him in, but we didn't. He then wandered off. We didn't hear from him for about, I don't know, 3 weeks. And then he came back and said, yes, he would like to go to rehab. And he then met a wonderful lady. He went to Glen, and she was a counsellor. Anyway, they married, and they had a son. But sadly, it was too late for Charlie, and he died drug-related. His liver packed up.
And what about Christopher? Because after having lost your two other boys, and then this tragedy with Christopher that you managed to avert.
Well, yes. I thought nothing more awful could happen to me. And it did. Christopher, our pride and joy, went on his gap year and had the most appalling accident in Belize. He was left on the road, nobody picked him up. Princess Margaret actually saved his life with, and I rang her to say we were trying to get out there to be with him. And she said, well, the British Army have a garrison there. And it was a Saturday, but Nigel Napier, who was our private secretary, also I rang, and he managed to get hold of somebody, and the army came, which they would have done for anybody, actually, any British person, and they picked him up he was flown to the garrison where there happened to be a surgeon there, and he's operated on a tent and then flown to Miami, where Colin and I managed to meet him, be there. I didn't recognize it. My mind sort of packed up, and I looked at this person lying, he's covered in blood, and I said, well, no, that's not Christopher. And they said, yes, it is. And it took me ages to actually realize it was him. And then I was determined I wasn't going to lose him. I knew that I was going to lose Charles and Henry, but I wasn't going to lose Christopher if I could. And I started, did everything. And my nanny, Barbara Barnes, who had left me to look after Prince William and Prince Harry, had just left that post. And she said, I'll give you 6 months. I'll come and look after him with you. And we treated him, in fact, it was what the doctors find it so interesting, the way we felt that people in comas should, that they asked us to write, we wrote something for the Lancet about how, as lay people, I mean, for instance, he couldn't swallow. And the doctor said, well, if he can't swallow this, not much, very difficult. And next day, Barbara brought a baby's bottle to the hospital, and the nurse said, what are you doing, Miss Barnes? She said, can I try it? Because he was her first baby, actually. And they put the teat between his lips, and she sort of did this, and he started to suck, and he swallowed. And then we had a coma kit, which we got together, which is stimulating the 5 senses. And we had sort of smelly shoe and a nice smell, a loud noise and a soft noise. And all my friends, I think, I couldn't have done it alone. And we had a great chart in his room of all one's friends who came, and you have to do it quarter of an hour in every hour, which most people can't. Anyway, I looked after him for 5 years, and he's been married twice. He's got 2 daughters by his first wife. The eldest one just got a first at King's the other day. He is now married a lovely second wife, and he's never been able to work. I mean, he's quite badly disabled. But he's just lovely. I mean, he often said, Mum, it's much worse for you. I wouldn't regret my life at all. It's been quite different. But I've had the opportunity to meet different people. And he's just a joy, actually, an absolute joy. So, really, my life has ended on a happy note.
And also, just one last point, as to when the Queen came to visit Princess Margaret towards the end of her days.
Well, yes, that's a funny little story. Because when Princess Margaret was ill, some of us used to read to her. And I must say, the most boring book she had called Seeds. And it turned out that Roddy had given it to her. And I got as far as potatoes. And I said, Ma'am, are you really interested in this book? Oh, yes, she said. Absolutely fascinating. Go on. Anyway, the Queen came to have tea with us. She was in bed. And I was waiting, because I lived with Princess Margaret for about a year at one point, and was waiting in the drawing room. And then I had the Queen coming downstairs. So I thought, oh, odd. I said, is everything all right, ma'am? And she said, well, not really. She said, Margaret's listening to the Archers. And every time I say anything, she says, shush. So I said, well, shall I come up and turn the wireless off? So she said, would you? So I went up and turned it off. So I think that's it, don't you?
I think that is it. I think we should thank Lady Glenconnor for a lovely afternoon. And we'll take a few questions.
Oh, yes, absolutely.